This interview is part of the Living Legends collection of the Oklahoma Historical Society. It is an interview with Mrs. Josie Crothers, interviewed May 24th, 1973, in Geary, Oklahoma by Pendleton Woods. It is being copied for inclusion in the permanent collection of the Oral History Program on March 13, 1990 by Joel Todd.
This is Penn Woods interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends. The date is May the 24th, 1973. We're in Geary, Oklahoma, and I'm interviewing Mrs. Josie. Is that Josie Ice? Is her maiden name? ICE Crothers, Crothers, of Geary, Oklahoma. Mrs. Crothers is a retired farm wife in the Geary area, and she came to Geary and to the Indian Territory, I believe, many years ago, which she will tell us about. Ms. Crothers, to begin with, why don't you tell us who your parents were and how they happened to come to this country?
Well, my father was A.N.I.'s, and he was from West Virginia. And, of course, he fought in the Southern Army. And he married my mother in Texas. My mother was Alabamian. And I was born in Texas, in San Saba County, Texas, and came to the Indian Territory when I was 6 months old in a covered wagon, as all people came then. And just across the river from Gainesville, Texas, is where we first landed. And we didn't have any mail, of course, or any towns, or any schools, or any churches. It was just a sparsely settled neighborhood. And we got our mail across the river at Old Fort Burlington. The mail, the government sent mail there, and then we forded Red River and went on and got our mail. And that was when I was a baby. And then we lived there quite a few years in that sparsely settled country.
How far did you have to travel to get your mail?
Well, to get the mail over to Fort Burlington, maybe 7 or 8 miles. But there was just a fort there, you know. It was an old kind of deserted fort, only the government hack stopped there with the mail coming to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And we had to go to Gainesville, Texas for our supply. And the men all the way, they went not one at a time, but several men together, because there was no roads and there were no bridges, and plenty of outlaws. It was, you know, Indian Territory then was just a place for the outlaws from Missouri and Texas and surrounding neighborhood, although they weren't outlaws. But that is where we got our mail. And then we lived there quite a few years, and then we moved to where, we left there and went to West Virginia. But when we come back, we settled where Ada, Oklahoma is now. There wasn't any post office there at all. We had to get our mail from Texas then. And
How were you traveling when you were on the Red River there? How did they go to get the mail? Horseback, or did they have...
Horseback, yes, because they had to ford the river, you see, and it wasn't so easy to ford it in a wagon. Well, of course they did ford it in wagons, but it wasn't very safe, because Red River it is a bigger river than it is now, because it hadn't been filled in with farm produces and things like that. So And we lived at Ada several years. And we did have a little school there. A Methodist preacher, he's a farmer, but he preached there a little while and taught school there a little while. And that was the first school I ever went to. And my mother was a educated Southern woman. And if she hadn't been, why, we children would have been heathens because there was no school to go to. And we lived there for, maybe 7 or 8 years. And then we moved to where Chickasha is now. But that was several years before there was any town there, before the Rock Island was extended into Texas. And after the town site was laid off there, why, then of course when the town was built, we did get a little school in there. And the town site was part of my father's farm. In the Indian Territory, you just had to have a $5 permit, and then you could run all the cattle or farm all the land that you wanted to. Although the farmers they farmed on a very small scale compared to what they do now. 2 horses and the plow was about what we used for.
Thinking back in terms, how long were you on how old were you when you moved from the Red River area to Ada?
I think I was about 6, 7 years old.
So you don't remember too much when you were living in the Red River area, do you?
Well,
do you remember much of that? Do you recall any experiences that you can remember when you were living in the Red River area there?
Nothing to mount anything. We just lived there, and that's all.
Can you think of any experiences that your father told you about that happened when you were in that area? Any stories or any experiences? Do you recall anything offhand?
No, I don't believe I can.
Your first memories then were in the Ada area. Why don't you describe what the school was like, this small school at Ada taught by the ministry?
The school that I went to, well, it was just an old plank schoolhouse with plank seats and a dirt floor and so forth. When I went to school there. And we lived there till I was, I don't know how old I was now. What was I saying?
How many classes in one school building did they have? Did they have all the classes together, or did you have separate first and second?
No, just one.
One class. Mm-hmm. And you had the same teacher taught all the grades at one time then, is that right?
Oh, yes, all the grades.
Mm-hmm.
And then my older sister, they sent her back to Texas and educated her, so she could teach us children, and teach school. And she taught school a time or two, a year or two, and then, of course, like she disappointed us. She got married and went to raising children of her own, so we didn't get to go to school to her very much.
What did they call that town then? It wasn't Ada. What did they call it? Or did they have a name?
They didn't call it. There wasn't any post office or even anything there then when we went there.
How much was there when you were there? How much was there when you were in that area?
How much was
How many buildings were there when you were there? In the Ada area?
Oh, there wasn't any buildings. There wasn't any town. We went to Texas. We still went to Texas for our groceries. No, we didn't have any town there.
Mm-hmm. None at all. Where was the nearest store to Ada then?
To Ada?
Yes, to where you were living there when you were in...
Well, there was a general store put in there, but that was before the post office was put in. Mm-hmm. The post office was put in later. Mm-hmm. And then when we left there, we moved to Chickasha. Mm-hmm. That is where Chickasha is now. That is several years, of course, before the railroad came through there. And I'll tell you about the schoolhouse my sister taught in. It was a log cabin, just one room log house, and it's covered with dirt and had a dirt floor, and the seats were logs just split in two and set on two stumps, and that's the seat we had. And they had one window just cut in the logs and had a flour sack, we called them, in tacked over it. That was how much we had. And our blackboard was a 1x12 painted black. That was what we used for a blackboard. So that's some more of our schooling.
And that was in the Ada area, is that right?
No,
In
that
the
was in
Chickasha area,
Chickasha.
in the Chickasha.
Yeah.
So when
Yeah.
she was teaching, you were living in the Chickasha area. Why did your parents move from the Red River to Ada and then to Chickasha? What attracted this move?
Well, it seemed like my father just, he didn't like to be fenced in. He wanted to be on the frontier. And we stayed on the frontier until we moved here to where Geary was. That was several years before Geary was built here, of course. But the post office, the Geary post office, was here when we moved here, but it was out on the farm, just in the farmhouse. And the mail hack came from El Reno to Watonga and dropped off the mail at this farmhouse. The mail, Will Berkey was the postmaster. And he dropped off the mail for two other post offices, the Judson post office, 6 miles west of Geary, and Eniho, 7 or 8 miles this way. And Dave Locke was the postmaster at Eniho, and Polk Salyers was the mail carrier. And I don't remember who the post office master was at Judson, but I remember who the mail carrier was, Fanny.
Well, we can get that. How long did, what years were you in Ada?
In Ada.
In Ada area.
Well, let's see, I must have been about 11 or 12 years old when we left Ada.
I see. And you're 92 now, is that right?
No, I was 95 in
95.
January.
Oh, well, that would be, then you were in the Ada area in about, would be about 85 years ago, which would be about 18, would it be in the 1890s, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And how long did you live in the Ada area?
Well, let's see how old I was. I was about 12 years old, I think, when we moved to Chickasha, to the Chickasha area.
So you were in Ada maybe a year or two, a couple of years.
3 years,
3
probably.
years.
Yeah.
Do you recall anything else about your in the Ada area? Any experiences there in the Ada area that you think would be particularly interesting? Anything exciting happen there?
No, there wasn't much that happened in that day of time. It was just a few scattered farmers, that was all, and we occasionally a circuit rider would come through. You know what a circuit
Yes, I know.
is.
How don't you tell about circuit riders?
But,
Tell about a circuit rider. Tell what a circuit rider is. I know what it is, but I think that...
well, a circuit rider is a man that just, he doesn't have any appointments. He just goes out and travels and stops and preaches along the way. And my grandfather was a Methodist preacher, so he always made our house his stopping place, and he preached at our house, too. If it was wintertime, he preached in the house, and if it was summertime, he preached out in the yard. And we just lived in log house, about a 2-3 room log house, something like that. That's all we had is log houses then, because there was no place to get lumber without going to Texas after it.
Did your grandfather, you mentioned, did he come to Oklahoma territory, the Indian Territory, with the rest of the family, or did he?
Oh, no.
He did not.
He died immediately after the close of the Civil War. Yes.
What about, were there any Indians in the 80 area then? Any Indians?
No, there wasn't any Indians there, not close to us. But when we moved to Chickasha, of course, we was close to Anadarko, and that is where the Comanche tribe got their rations and so forth. And I did have quite an experience with the Indians there.
Tell about that.
Well, they had they drove cattle from Texas, those old longhorn cattle, and fed them after they put the Indians on the reservations, confined them to reservations. Well, then, of course, the government fed them. And they drove cattle up from Texas, old longhorns, and it's just below Anadarko, where Anadarko is now. And, of course, Anadarko is there because it's an Indian agency. And they was going to give them a big 4th of July. 4th of July came, and they was going to let them kill the cattle with bows and arrows. And that was the Comanches. And they had the most beautiful horses, and the boys that rode them, of course they were all young men, and they had trained them till they guided them with their knees. The horses didn't have anything on at all. They were just horses. And the Indian boys had just a bleach crowd on, you know what that is. About what these girls wear now. And they had buffaloes and bears and wolves painted on their back, They was greased till they just looked beautiful and shiny, the bodies was. And then they had these on there. So they turned the cattle out of the corral where they had it there and let the Indians kill them with bows and arrows. And of course they lined the white people all up in a circle, and they put some Indian police and 2 United States Marshals right in front of the line of wagons. So if they failed to kill them, why, then they'd shoot them so they wouldn't get out among the people, you see. But they didn't fail at all. They killed every one of them. They killed all with the bows and arrows. They shot them right behind the forelegs. And of course, soon as they got them killed, well, they left, and then the squaws skinned them and fixed them to eat. And then in the afternoon, that took till about noon, they had sweepstake races. 7 or 8 Indians and 2 white men was in the sweepstakes. And one of the white boys' horse fell in the race for some reason. He fell, the white boy's horse did. And the Indian behind him, his horse stumbled and threw the Indian over on the ground and broke his neck and killed an Indian boy. And then the Indians, you could just hear the little squaws singing those little war songs, and awful. And they sent out the police then and took all the weapons away from the Indians and locked them up in the blockhouse there at Anadarko. So that was our experience with the Indians there.
Was the horse killing, was the purpose of that for entertainment or for meat or for both? Was it apparently for both, since they did eat the horses?
Which one?
The killing of the horses, that was a form of entertainment, apparently. Was this entertainment for the benefit of the Indians or for the benefit of the white people who were there, or both?
Both.
For both.
Yes. Yes.
The did they generally eat horses then? Did they eat horses ordinarily then?
They never eat horses.
Well, you said they skinned them and took the meat. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said they killed them. Did I misunderstand?
No, kill the boy.
No. I mean, did they go ahead.
I think she meant they killed the longhorn the longhorn cattle, didn't you? They killed the longhorn cattle.
Oh, no, in this
The
sweepstakes race I'm going to talk about now, the white boy's horse fell.
Yes.
And the Indian's horse stumbled over and killed the rider,
Yes.
the boy that was riding.
No, I didn't mean that. I meant the earlier, where they were firing the bows at them, bows and arrows at them. Was that the cattle they were firing at, or the horses? I may have misunderstood.
No, the horse, the beef
Yes,
is killing.
the cattle.
Yes,
Oh, I
they issued them so many beef every week, but they give them a double issue because it's 4th of July,
Yes.
and no, there's a killing of cattle.
Big
but-
longhorn cattle.
Yes.
Did they do this ordinarily, or was it did they kill them that way ordinarily, or was it just on a special event?
Oh, this is the last time they ever allowed the Comanches to use bows and arrows. No, it was just a special. They didn't allow them. It wasn't allowed, only just allowed because it was the 4th of July, and kind of to make the Indians better friends and all, you know.
But it backfired when one of them got killed.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that is when they all got angry, you know, and the old squaws sung those awful songs. I can hear 'em. I was scared. I wanted to come home right then, but my brothers wouldn't come because they wanted to see a mud dance. They had a mud dance that night, and the mud dance is where they covered the Indian all up in mud, you know, and then they danced just in mud. They didn't even have anything else on. And we stayed for the mud dance. And that was about the last experience we had with the Indians because them.
That's very interesting. Had you had any other earlier experiences with Indians?
No. When after we first came to the Indian territory, why, on the moonlight nights, why the Indians would come in there and steal horses. Now, they didn't ever bother cattle because they only just as many as they could eat because there was no place to dispose of them. But they'd come in, and I know my father would take his mules. They used mules mostly then. He'd take them out in the brush and tie them in the brush of a night so they couldn't see them in the pasture and the corral when they'd raid in there. But they never did get any of our horses, but they did get a lot of horses.
Now, was this while you were living at Chickasha?
Yeah.
Were you on a...
No, where they raided in, that is when we first come to the Indian
First
territory.
came to the territory.
Yes.
How large was the farm that you lived on then? Or did it have any boundaries?
I say, you just went in and plowed as much as you wanted to, but they used walking plows and 2 horses, so they didn't have very big farms. And anyway, they had to haul the cotton. Cotton was the only thing they could haul that far, you know. And when we was at Ada, my father put up a gin. He hauled material on ox wagons from Texas and put up a gin. And you could gin the cotton, you know, and then you could haul 3 bales on a wagon. And then they'd haul it to Texas and sell it. And they went about twice a year, you know, because several wagons go together because they need help, you know, to pull out of creeks and rivers, and But they never was attacked. The outlaws never did bother them. They never was robbed.
I doubt if they'd want to rob a bale of cotton anyway. They'd want to rob them when they came back with the money, isn't that right?
Yeah, when they come back with the groceries.
Yeah.
They didn't come back with money. They
Just
spent it all
come
for
back
the
with
years
groceries.
to was. Yeah.
How long did it take to make the trip to bring a bale of cotton in and come back?
Oh, a week or longer, I'm sure. I don't remember. Of course, I was a child, but it took quite a while for them to take the wagon train, and go to Texas and come back to Ada.
Did you ever make any of those trips back to Texas?
No, I never did.
Now you lived in Chickasha. How long were you in Chickasha? When did you move away from there?
Well, we moved away from there when we moved here when we left Chickasha. I think I was I believe I was 17 years old maybe when we moved here.
And where did you move here? Where is your farm in relation to Geary?
It's how far is it over to where Dwight normally lives?
7 or 8 miles.
Is it
About 7 or 8 miles east.
7 or 8 miles. Yeah.
Now you went to school in Chickasha for a year. Why don't you then return to Geary, where you later met and married your husband?
J.W. Crothers.
J.W. Crothers.
Yeah.
Where did you meet him?
How did you meet him?
Yes.
Oh, at a schoolhouse over here. I was having literary, we called it then.
Literary near Geary. Tell us about a literary.
But,
Tell us about a literary. You know, a lot of ladies met their husbands in literaries. Why don't you tell me about literary?
well, we'd have discussions, about this one thing and then another, and mostly we had a good time visiting. We'd have a program, we'd have program leaders, and we'd have different subjects, that we'd discuss, and we'd have singing, we'd have some songbooks, of course no musical instruments that day and time.
Where did you hold the literaries?
Well, it is right over where the cemetery is now. They call it the old McIntyre Schoolhouse, and that is where we held the literary. It's about just over to cemetery.
Who would lead the literaries generally?
Oh, just first one, then another. We was all, we was just playing at it. Didn't any of us know hardly what we was doing.
Literary was really then a combination of social as well as cultural, obviously.
Yeah. Oh, literary was in Sunday school and church was about all we had, and dances. I wasn't allowed to dance because my people didn't believe in dancing, but till after I passed 18, then I danced. And I enjoyed going to dances. Square dances, of course we didn't have anything else in. Then we just danced around in the neighbors. And we went to one place up in the Blackjacks to dance, and the floor was made out of just split logs, And we didn't do much dancing up there. It was too rough.
So basically your social events were your square dances, your literaries, and your church.
Yes. And the first time I went to church was at the Mennonite church, and it was out north of Geary here on Brother Crable's farm. And later, when the town was built here, they brought it to Geary. It's here now, the same old church that was out there. And no, I don't think so. They got a new church out in the Merle. Yeah, they tore it down. It was just an old plank house. And they tore it down. They got a nice church here now.
You mentioned here John Cross, your brother-in-law, killed by bank robbers while on duty as Geary City Marshal. Why don't you tell a little about your brother-in-law, and his experiences as a city marshal?
Well, Mr. Cross was also a deputy sheriff in Canadian County, because, then they'd run over into Blaine County if they got too rough on Canadian, and we lived right on the line, you see. It's right in the middle of Geary, the line is. And he was the first city marshal, and I don't know how long. Of course, he had a night watchman, Ollie Wilburn, and he was coming home. He had a farm. He bought the farm after he didn't ever run and get the farm. He bought it. And just north of Geary now, he even joined Geary. And he was coming home one night, and it was a nice, bright moonlight night. And of course, he had his star on. And there was two men standing by the side of the road. It's right in the middle of Geary, the line is. And he was the first city marshal. And I don't know how long. Of course, he had a night watchman, Ollie Wilburn. And he was coming home. He had a farm. He bought the farm after he didn't ever run and get the farm. He bought it. And just north of Geary now, he even joined Geary. And he was coming home one night, and it was a nice, bright moonlight night. And of course, he had his star on. And there was two men standing by the side of the road holding their horses. And that's the last we know, only just surmise what it was. But anyway, he had shot one bullet out of his six-shooter, Mr. Cross had, but he was shot and died just almost instantly, fell off of his horse right there. And these men then, they'd come here to rob the bank. We found out later that they had robbed the bank at Dover that day, and they was going to rob the Geary Bank that night. And so Mr. Cross lay there then till morning, and they'd shot the horse as he was riding through the air, and he'd bled all over his face, And next morning, my sister just slept through. She usually woke up when he come home of the night, but she didn't that night. So the next morning, the horse was standing by the gate, and the hard hand, of course, found him, and they went and looked for Mr. Cross then and found him laying in the road where he'd fallen off on the horse when they shot him. And then they didn't try to rob the bank. They left. We supposed that the shot he shot hit one of the men. We didn't know. But they got away, they left, and then my two brothers followed them. They went to Chickasha, where Heck Thomas, he was one of the noted officers. He's in the Hall of Fame, of course. And our brother-in-law, Joe Cordell, had rode with him for 2 years. And Mr. Thomas had retired, and Mr. Cordell is dead. And they went and got him to go with them out to that old mountain stronghold where they knew they denned up, the outlaws. They were part Indians, Sam and Bill Martin, that was their names. And when they got about half a mile or a quarter of a mile, Heck Thomas told the boys, Charlie and Ben, said, "Now you boys stay here, Don't come any close to her because you're not used to dealing with outlaws, and I've dealt with them for 30 years. And said, I'm going up and investigate, and if the old claybank horse is in the corral, they're there. And if the claybank's gone, why, they won't be there. So they wasn't there. And then a few weeks later, I don't know why, some marshal down, I can't remember his name, down in the eastern part of the state, killed both of them. And of course they called my brothers, and they went down there. And where they found out it was the Martin boys, they had Mr. Cross's 6-shooter and belt and his watch. And of course they sent them back to my sister, and there wasn't no trial because they were both dead. So that ended that trial.
You mentioned a red horse, Cheyenne Indian, a horse thief caught with your stolen horse. Why don't you tell about that?
About who?
Red horse, Cheyenne Indian.
Oh, red horse.
Yes.
Well, he was a Cheyenne, and he was a bad Indian, and they sent him down to these Cheyennes here. And he lived about 1.5 miles from us in a teepee. And, of course, that is where Geary's ever built here. So we just occasionally we'd lose a horse. It'd be gone. And we never could find it. So one night he come in, he couldn't talk English. So he come and wanted something to eat. He could make himself known. And I went to the kitchen and fixed him some supper and something to eat. And one of my brothers had come in and left the bridle hanging on the gate, on the yard gate. He hadn't taken it to the barn. And so next morning, the bridle is gone and the horse is gone out of the pasture. And Papa said, Red Horse got that horse because, said, I heard our dogs bark and bark and bark down in the pasture, and then I heard his dogs bark. So the boys went down there, my brothers, there's a big lot of timber there, you know, and they watched all day Sunday, or Saturday night as they took him. And about sundown they saw Red Horse take a bucket and go to the river and go back in the timber. And of course they followed him, and he was taking water to the horse. And of course they turned it over to the police, and they come out and got him and put him in jail a while. And then they had the trial, and they summoned him to sentence him to 2 years in the penitentiary at Leavenworth, of course. And he wanted to come out and stay with his family, stay all night with his family before they sent him to Leavenworth, and they allowed him to because he was an Indian and couldn't talk or anything, couldn't say any English. So that night the police was guarding him. He laid down outside of the teepee and went to sleep, and I guess slept all night. And when he woke up next morning, why, Red Horse was dead. His wife had given him poison and killed him. And so that ended that experience.
You mentioned in your questionnaire the first man killed in Geary in a gunfight in a saloon. Does this recall?
Yeah. The first man he is a man from El Reno, and his name Hudspeth. I don't know his first name. And he's killed in this saloon. Well, he had some trouble with the bartender or somebody, the bartender killed him. And then it was Phil Houck's saloon, and later, Phil Houck drowned in the toilet. He went out, he was drunk, and these old-fashioned toilets, you know, and they found him drowned in there. So that was the first man that was killed.
You miss an outdoor toilet?
Oh,
That's right.
sure.
Right.
His
Open
outdoor
street, yeah.
toilet.
Yeah.
That's where we had any
Yeah,
open.
that's what I thought.
Yeah.
You mentioned the first postmasters and mail carriers. You want to talk about them?
Well, the the first postmaster, the post office was here when we moved here, but it's out on a farm about a mile north of Geary here, just in a resident house. And Will Berkey was the postmaster. And, well, I think I done told you about, didn't I, about the mail carriers.
Yes.
Yeah.
You mentioned Black Coyote, the chief of the Cheyennes. Do you want to tell about him?
Well, Black Coyote.
Yes.
Well, he was the chief of police, and they had as many wives as they wanted to a long time ago, but they made them all quit having the plurality of wives. They just had one wife, but they let Coyote keep his two wives. They were sisters. And they issued beef every week just across the river from where we lived, and so that time they was over there, and they usually had a dance, and a powwow after they issued them the beef. And it come up an awful rain, and the river got up so deep that they just had to almost swim, and got all wet and all. So they stopped at our house and wanted to stay all night, and we let them sleep. Just made them, they had their own, their bed was all wet. Mama just gave them some comforts, and they lay on the floor. And my sister and me, we decided which one he'd sleep with that night, and he slept with both of them. He slept between them. And they had two little boys that was just 6 weeks old. It's almost the same age, Howlin' Wolf and Howlin' Pipe. And they both got the pneumonia and died. And they didn't try to get the doctor, wanted a doctor. They come over, and Mama fixed up some home remedies like she did for her own kids, but they died. And he had a son, Harry Coyote, and he was a Carlisle student. The ones that sent to Carlisle, why, they just kept right there. They didn't let them come back every year and turn back the Indians. So Harry had a good education, and so he had the measles, and the way they treated the measles, they took him out and put him in a little bitty teepee and put hot rocks in there and poured water on them, and then put the measles patient in there and steamed them. And of course, he died in about 2 hours of that treatment. So that is all we know about this Coyote Hill here. That was his property, the name for Coyote. He's a nice old Indian. We liked him. He could say a few words of English.
You mentioned your husband, Wes, and your brother, Charlie Ice, helping to build the grade for the railroad track into Geary. Can you tell about that, and maybe a little bit about the railroad coming in?
Well, no, they were just doing the teamwork, Of course, it's all teamwork then. Grading, to lay the track. And they worked there several weeks. And of course, we was all so excited when that train come from Geary that we was all over watching the train come in.
Which train was it? Which railroad was it?
The Rock Island.
Rock Island. Can you describe the occasion when the Rock Island came through for the first time? Can you tell about that a little bit? Did they have any celebration?
Well, we just, I don't think we had a celebration. We settled on Bill Huff's farm. It joined my brother-in-law's farm, Mr. Cross. They joined, the two farmers did.
What did the coming of the railroad mean to the town? What did it do to what was the result of the railroad coming into the town?
Well, it's right nice for the Geary people. They built a roundhouse here, Of course, the railroad, when it's extended from the north through here. It was first from the east, out west to the Amarillo. And then after a while, the railroad spur of it, you know, come down from Kansas, or I don't know where it come from up there, and went on to Anadarko that way. And then they had a big roundhouse there, and Geary was really a booming town then, twice as much business and everything as it is now. And then when they, you know, later years, well, that is many years after that, why they discontinued that railroad from Geary to Anadarko. And, well, it went on from Anadarko. I don't know where it went on to Texas. And after they took the railroad, the roundhouse away from there, why then there wasn't anything in Geary. There was no factories, nor just farmers, mostly the town people, and there wasn't any business. It never has recovered. It isn't in business here now.
What were the first industries that came into Geary?
Well, the first I can remember was a broom factory, and that was run by Mr. Chitwood, Jim Chitwood. He put up a broom factory here, and that is the first that I remember of.
What other industries have you had here?
Well, we just haven't had any more.
The gin.
Oh, yes. We had a cotton gin, and a man named Mercer, Mr. Mercer, he had the first cotton gin. And then, of course, they put up an elevator, and that is a farmer's, the cooperative elevator. And Brother Crable belonged to it, and they got to fussing over it, and then Brother Crable drew out. He wouldn't be interested in it when there's a fussing over the proceeds.
You were one of the first members of the South Methodist Church in Geary. Why don't you tell us a little about your church?
Well, I'll tell you first about I thought it was the South Methodist. It wasn't as a Presbyterian church, because I had a sister-in-law. I don't know whether she belonged to it or not, but she went to Sunday school there, and she set me right on that. She said that was before. The next one was South Methodist, and of course we were South Methodist till the churches verged several years after that, the North and South. You know, everything after the Civil War, everything south of the Mason-Dixon line was Southern, and North was the North Methodist.
Tell about your church services or your church activities during this earlier period here.
The first
Church activities, how do they differ? Did they differ then from now? Your church activity, what happened in the church?
There wasn't much happened then. Not a whole lot of this junk that they have in the churches now. We just went to church, and the preacher got up and preached the sermon, and we had Sunday school, and we used the literature, you know, and that is about all there was to the church. We had we didn't call it, what did we call it a long time ago, Myrna?
I don't remember.
Ladies, it wasn't a ladies' aid.
Circles?
Anyway, if we needed money up here, or they did, I still belong to the other church. But we had a church out in the country where I live now, and we had church in the afternoon. The preacher preached out of the North Methodist. He preached up at Geary he lived in Geary and preached there in the morning, and then he come out in the country to that schoolhouse and preached in the afternoon. And one of the women asked me how we raised money out in the country to pay for him and pay him, and I said, well, we just find out how much we know how much he charges, and we just take up a collection. And she said, well, we have to work up here. We have to sell custard pies and do this, that, and the other to make a little money. But the country people, you know, there wasn't very many of them, and they didn't charge very much. But we had a church out there for quite a few years in the country. And they had a union Sunday school, and I was superintendent of the union Sunday school.
You were active in the Federated Clubs. That's the Federated Women's Clubs. Tell us about that and about your activity in that.
Well, while we was in the Federated Clubs, we had Miss Tom Black was the president of the Federated Clubs, and I was the first vice president. And we decided to put water out to the cemetery. We'd hauled water out to that cemetery for years in milk cans and buckets, and so that was our project that year. Our club went out in 1 year. I don't know why we didn't stay in the Federated Clubs any longer. I don't remember. But anyway, we furnished the money to the Federated Clubs, furnished the money to buy the material, and then the men in town worked and for nothing. They donated the work to dig the ditches and lay the lines and all and dig the well. So then we had water out at the cemetery, but before, why, we didn't have.
Tell about the Social Hour Club.
Well, the Social Hour Club was organized, what year, Marty, you know?
1912.
1912. It was organized by my sister-in-law, Ella Crothers, at her home, and there was several members there, you know, several women there, and we joined the club, and they're all dead now. I'm the only charter member living. Ella has been dead for a couple of years, but I'm the one that's left living, and Ella named it the Common Ladies Club. And so Miss Galloway, this Earl Galloway's mother, she said, Josie, let's ask Ella if we can't change that name. She said, I don't feel common. And I said, well, I don't either. So we couldn't decide among ourselves what to call it. So Mr. Brake, he had a shoe store, and he was an undertaker here then. So Mr. Brake named it the Social Hour Club. So, and we've had, I'm sure a lot more than 100 members, but they're pretty all gone. It's dwindled down now to how many we have, Merle?
About 15.
About 15.
Am I correct when you said you drove a school bus?
Yeah.
Tell about driving a school
Well, when the first war broke out, you know.
World War I?
One war, yeah. Why, they didn't, they called all the able-bodied men we had. You remember that we had to make up our army. And so they asked for women volunteers to do men's work. And of course I had a house full of young'uns, and I was working on the farm, living on the farm, right where I'm living now. I've been living there for 66 years in that one house. And so I volunteered to drive the school van. And they had a horse-drawn van, a real nice horse-drawn van, all glass windows and everything nice. And I drove it till after the war was over, and then, you know, the Depression struck about that time, plenty hard. So I was getting $80 a month for driving it. So I drove on and on and on till I drove 9 years. So I could give up my job.
Tell about describe this bus, this
Bus.
How it operated, yes.
Well, it just looked like these buses that run in town, and it turned around, you know. You could just turn around. You didn't have to go away around, turn the horses around, that'd turn the bus around. It was pretty and had nice seats and all. And I drove that horse bus for, maybe 3 or 4 years, and then we got a motor.
And you drove it after that?
Yeah, drove it.
How many would the horse bus hold?
Oh, I remember it probably a capacity of 20, but we could squeeze 40 in if we had to.
What kind of tires did it? What kind of wheels did it have? Did it have tires?
Little bitty narrow steel wheels. And no roads just to speak of, just old paths, The roads wasn't good at all then like they are now, because there'd never been any grading or anything done on them.
Describe that first motor bus. Describe its engine and how it worked.
That first bus was a Ford pickup. No, Ford, there wasn't no pickups then. Ford, what number? Truck, a Ford truck. And it had a canvas top on it and had seats made, long seats. Didn't have them like them. And that is what I drove the rest of the time I drove.
How'd you start it? Did you have to crank the motor?
Sure, if you could.
Tell about cranking the motor.
I never cranked it. I never could crank it. My husband or some of my sons, I had 2 sons going to school there. One of them would crank it in the morning, and then if it quit running, why some of the boys who had big boys, they'd get out and crank it. I never could crank one. I didn't have a strong woman, but I never could crank a Ford.
Tell about some of the problems of driving one of those things. I'm sure you had car trouble from time to time. Tell about some of the car trouble you had.
Well, the most trouble we had was getting stuck, and then I didn't have any trouble. I had so many big boys in there, they just got out and pushed it out. But one time it come a real hard rain, and the water was coming down off McCall's Hill, and I was afraid to drive into it, it was just deep with all those kids. And I just sat there and I thought, well, what in the world am I going to do? I'm not going to drive into that water with all these children. And I looked over the hill, up the hill, and I saw 3 men coming horseback. And I thought, well, that's fine. So when they got down there, one was my nephew, Leo Cordell, and the other one was this Earl Galloway we talk about, and his brother. So they just hooked on the horses on them and pulled me out.
What if you have any questions? Yes. Things that we may not have covered.
That's the reason I wrote those notes.
Tell about the first school in Geary, the dugout type school.
Well, Mr. Robertson, I. Robertson, was the teacher, and he was talking in that dugout. Of course, my children didn't go there because I don't know why they didn't go to Geary. Did. Oh, I know, we had a little country school out there they went to. But this Hardy Robertson lives here now, quite a prominent farmer, is his father. And his mother went to school to his father, and then later they got married. So he married one of his 2 pupils, that is Hardy's mother.
Josie, tell them about Ben, your brother, finding Jesse Chisholm's grave.
Yes. When we first come here, maybe a year after we moved here, why, a bunch of our horses, we brought, we had horses and cattle when we came here. My father was fairly well fixed. And a bunch of the horses strayed and got away, and Ben was hunting them, and he come to this spring, the left-hand spring, and he got down to water his horse and rest a while, and he was just walking around, looking around while the horse rested, and he found this stone, so this just outline, or you might say, of this stone buried, and he dug the dirt away, and it was Jesse Chisholm's tombstone, just cut in a piece of native rock, of course, his name and his date when he died. And so they sent a man out from Oklahoma City to interview my brother, and they went up to the grave, and he told him about it, and he took his picture, and it's in the Daily Oklahoman. Of course, they put it back in there. But later, why,
Do you think of anything else we ought to talk about? You can't.
I think I've said enough.
You think you've condensed 95 years into 1 hour?
What is it?
Have you condensed 95 years now into 1 hour?
Yes, in the 1 hour.
Well, this has been a real fine interview made in Geary on May the 24th, 1973, with Mrs. Josie Crothers. Is it Crothers or Crothers?
Crothers.
Josie Crothers, Crothers. We're in Geary, Oklahoma, May 24, 1973.
This interview is part of the Living Legends collection of the Oklahoma Historical Society. It is an interview with Mrs. Josie Crothers, interviewed May 24, 1973, in Geary, Oklahoma by Pendleton Woods. It is being copied for inclusion in the permanent collection of the Oral History Program on March 13, 1990 by Joel Todd.
This is Penn Woods interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends. The date is